Collapse and comeback. In 1996, a small California chip company had about 30 days of cash left. Its first product had flopped. Half the staff were already gone. The founder took what money remained and bet all of it on a chip that existed only as software, a design no one had ever physically held. That company was Nvidia. 30 years later, that same company would be worth $4 trillion, the first business in history to reach that mark, by building the engines behind the entire artificial intelligence boom. Not by selling more games, but by selling the shovels for a gold rush that hadn't started yet. This is the story of how a company that made graphics cards for video games ended up running AI. It's a comeback almost no one saw coming. Nvidia began in 1993, reportedly sketched out by 3 engineers in a roadside Denny's near San Jose. Jensen Huang, Chris Malachowski, and Curtis Preem had a simple, risky idea. Personal computers were about to need dedicated hardware just to draw 3D graphics, and a specialist chip could do it far better than a general-purpose processor. It was a bet on a market that barely existed. Home PCs in 1993 mostly showed flat, blocky images. The founders were wagering that immersive 3D games were coming, that gamers would pay for them, and that Nvidia could build the silicon to make them run. Their first chip, the NV1, shipped in 1995, and it was a costly misfire. Nvidia had chosen an unusual way to build shapes on screen, using curved surfaces called quadratics. Almost everyone else, including Microsoft's new DirectX standard, settled on tiny triangles instead. When Windows and the biggest game makers standardized on triangles, the NV1 was suddenly the odd chip out. Games written for the industry standard simply wouldn't run well on it. Sales collapsed, returns piled up, and a company that had raised money on a bold technical promise now had a warehouse of hardware almost no one wanted. The clock started ticking. By 1996, Nvidia was reportedly about 30 days from running out of money. Jensen Huang made the hardest call a founder can make and laid off roughly half the company, shrinking to a skeleton crew just to survive. The lifeline came from an unlikely place. Sega, the Japanese gaming giant, had hired Nvidia to build a chip for a console, and even as that deal fell apart, a Sega executive kept faith in Huang and pushed through a reported $5 million investment. It was enough to buy about 6 months. Nvidia was still alive, but only just, and only if its next chip, its last real shot, actually worked. That chip was the RIVA 128, and the gamble around it became legend. Nvidia had no money and no time to build test versions, wait, and fix mistakes the usual way. So the team designed the chip inside a software simulator, then ordered mass production before a single working piece of silicon had ever been held in anyone's hand. If the design was wrong, the company was finished. It was right. When the RIVA 128 launched in 1997, it was fast, cheap, and compatible, and it reportedly sold more than 1 million units within 4 months. The near-death company had its first real hit, and a future. 2 years later, in 1999, Nvidia went public at $12 a share. That same year, it shipped the GeForce 256 and coined a term the whole industry would adopt: the GPU, or graphics processing unit. The pitch was that this was not just a video card but a specialized processor in its own right. It sounded like marketing, but buried in that idea, a chip built to do thousands of small calculations at once, was the seed of everything Nvidia would later become. Gamers loved it, and for the first time in its life, Nvidia looked less like a survivor and more like a leader. The turn came in 2006, and almost nobody understood it at the time. Nvidia released something called CUDA, a way for ordinary programmers to use a graphics chip for general maths, not just drawing games. The reason it mattered is simple. A graphics chip is built to do thousands of small calculations at the same time, in parallel, instead of one after another. That happens to be exactly what heavy scientific and mathematical work needs too. Nvidia spent years, and real money, adding this ability while its core customers were still just gamers. For a long time, it looked like an expensive detour. Then, in 2012, came the twist that changed everything. A team of researchers entered a famous image recognition contest with a neural network, a program loosely modeled on the brain called AlexNet. Instead of training it on normal processors, they trained it on two Nvidia gaming graphics cards, using CUDA. It didn't just win. It crushed the field by a margin so large it stunned the research community. The lesson landed fast. The same chips built to render explosions in video games were breathtakingly good at the maths behind artificial intelligence. Overnight, Nvidia's gaming hardware became the most wanted tool in machine learning. Nvidia leaned in hard. It began designing chips and whole computers aimed squarely at AI research. In 2016, it built the DGX-1, a machine purpose-made for training neural networks, and Jensen Huang personally delivered one of the first units to a young lab called OpenAI. At the time, this was a niche bet on a niche field. Most investors still saw Nvidia as a company that sold cards to gamers. The idea that AI would one day drive the entire business still sounded like science fiction. It was about 5 years early. Then, in late 2022, an AI chatbot called ChatGPT arrived, and the world changed almost overnight. Suddenly, every big technology company wanted to build artificial intelligence, and to do that they needed one thing above all: Nvidia's chips, especially a data center processor called the H100. Demand went vertical. Look at the revenue. In its 2020 financial year, Nvidia took in about $11 billion. By its 2024 year, that was around $61 billion. A year after that, it reached roughly $130 billion, more than doubling in 12 months, driven overwhelmingly by data center chips for AI. The stock market's verdict was just as steep. Nvidia crossed $1 trillion in value in May 2023. Less than a year later, in February 2024, it passed $2 trillion. By June 2024, it touched $3 trillion. And in July 2025, it became the first company ever to be worth $4 trillion, more than the entire economies of most nations on Earth. A business that had been counting down its final 30 days of cash was now, by market value, the most valuable company humankind had ever built. The contrast is the whole point. In the same years Nvidia was climbing, its old rival Intel, for decades the undisputed king of computer chips, largely missed the shift to AI and saw its fortune slide. We told that story in our film on Intel. The two companies had access to the same market, the same signals, the same customers. One had spent a lonely decade building a tool for a use that didn't exist yet. The other assumed the future would look like the past. It's the clearest lesson this channel keeps finding. Giants rarely fall to a better rival overnight. They fall to a future they chose not to prepare for. So that's what happened to Nvidia, a gaming chip company that came 30 days from death, then quietly built the machinery an entire technological era would run on. The comeback wasn't luck. It was a bet placed years before anyone else understood the game. One line if you take nothing else. The boring, expensive bets, the ones that make no sense for years, are sometimes the ones that decide everything. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe. New collapses and comebacks land 3 times a week.